Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. It's time for another Heartfelt Haftarah. Yes, it's a week later than the recording you viewed last week, and yet I am still wearing the same clothing and the same kippah. I'm trying to get a little ahead because of summer. I'll be traveling, and so it'd be a good idea just to sort of have a couple in front. And of course, Bob is because he is magnificent, Bob. He is always reminding me that I may be away, so I should record these. So anyway, luckily for me, luckily for me, these next few weeks are all portions I'm very familiar with. I don't really have to do a lot of research on them. I can pretty much talk about them right on the spot, and such is the case here. So our Torah portion for this week is Behaalotecha. And in it, in the book of Numbers, it discusses a number of things, including the menorah. Remember, of course, that the temple menorah is 7 branches as compared to a Hanukkah, which is 9. And so we're discussing this wonderful, I think, very powerful symbol that's underappreciated in Judaism. I mean, the 7 branches represent the 7 days of creation. The middle one sort of represents Shabbat, if you imagine it that way, and then you have the other branches. And of course, the traditional representation of the menorah is that each of the branches upward in a semicircle, as I like to imagine it, all the days of creation reaching up towards God. And then, of course, the menorah also stands in stylistically for the burning bush. So I think it's a wonderful and clever symbol of our tradition. And it's really a shame we don't make more use of it because I think it's really kind of fabulous. All right. In any case, Behaalotecha talks about the menorah. And so, not surprisingly, the Haftarah finds somewhere in the prophets where they're talking about a menorah. Now, in this particular case, there is a partial reuse, and that is that the famous passage in which the menorah is described in a vision by the prophet Zechariah, and it concludes with the famous lines, "Not by might and not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord." We've already used that for Hanukkah. And we've used that earlier. However, this particular Haftarah includes another vision of the prophet that occurs earlier, and that's what I'm going to focus on, the one before the menorah vision. And of course, we're including it because of the menorah, but I'm going to turn my attention elsewhere. Now, as far as tent peg business goes, we should be reminded that Zechariah is one of 3 prophets that are recognized after the end of the Babylonian exile. There is ample evidence that there were prophets running around all over the place, and Zechariah makes a point of criticizing those would-be prophets that people are encountering, and they can't make any sense of who's a real prophet versus who is an untrustworthy prophet. Zechariah talks about how these fake prophets or these charlatans will be shamed, but he points to a very, very difficult problem, and that is, how do you recognize a legitimate prophet versus how do you recognize a false prophet? And I'm thinking at this point that the status of the prophet has become such an exalted idea in post-exilic Judaism, which is also the earliest Judaism rather than Israelite religion, where prophets were also all over the place, and we sort of waited for history to tell us which ones were legitimate. The people were struggling with identifying a proper prophet from a charlatan prophet or a maniac or a deluded person. And so we're coming to the end of the Institute of Prophecy. And in fact, the men of the Great Assembly would eventually declare, after Zechariah's successor, Malachi, that the institution of prophecy has been suspended forever until the coming of the Messiah, right? When we'll get Elijah back, and he's a reliable prophet. So we'll know that the Messianic era has occurred. And the Talmud goes on to say that prophecy has been given over to children and madmen. Now, that doesn't mean that Jews cannot access the will of God by other means, and foremost by reading the Bible itself, but by other mechanisms also. But they never rise to the status of prophecy as it appears in the Bible. But for this purpose, Zechariah is a recognized prophet, and so we're going to give him the attention he's entitled to. All right, so what's going on in our Haftarah portion? Well, before the whole menorah thing, there is a wonderful passage dealing with the issue of restoring the purity of the temple worship. We were Israelites before the exile. We are Judeans, or we're becoming Jews, as a group following that. So how do we establish legitimacy of this newly restored system? And one of the things that they're confronted with is the status of the high priest. You can pick someone out who is from the genealogy of Zadok, who was David's high priest. But how much was that interrupted? Can this be trusted? Are these high priests suitable to God? And in this particular case, there is apparently a Persian appointed high priest by the name of Joshua. And clearly there are some questions about his legitimacy. Has he been tainted by his life in exile in Babylon? And so Zechariah reports this vision that he has that clarifies this question. And always in Zechariah's stories, what he sees are visions. It's not so much that he has an audition, that he hears God speaking, so much as he sees things. And what he hears is there is an angel standing next to him, or maybe inside of him, an interpretive angel who explains his visions to him. And so here's what's going on in this particular vision. All right. God showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing in front of the angel of the Eternal, and the accuser, Hasatan. This is one of the only two times that Satan is mentioned in the entire Hebrew Bible. And Satan is not a proper name. It's a position. He is the accuser. He's the prosecuting attorney in the divine court. The accuser was standing on the right side to accuse him. And this is an interesting little tidbit, that when a defendant is brought to court in ancient Israel, the prosecuting attorney or the person accusing him would stand on his right side, and an advocate who would defend him would stand on his left. So here you see this vision sees basically a court proceeding. And the Eternal says to the accuser, the Eternal rebukes you, O Satan. The Eternal who chooses Jerusalem rebukes you. Is not Joshua a brand plucked out of the flame? What? So before the court proceeding has even gone forward, the judge, who is God, says, no, we're not going to go forward with this proceeding. And I rebuke you as the accuser because Joshua is a special case. The wonderful phrase, a brand plucked from the fire. You can imagine pulling out a stick from a campfire where one end of it is burning or has burned and is burned off. So what God is saying is that this is a special case because this man has endured exile. He has already had his punishment for whatever sins he or his ancestors committed, and therefore we're going to end this proceedings, and we're going to go straight to the idea that he is in fact the legitimate high priest. And so what then happens is it says, now Joshua stood before the angel dressed in filthy clothing. Now, soim, the word filthy, is a fabulous word in biblical um, language. It's usually translated as filthy. One could translate it in a kind of slightly archaic English as befouled. But it's a perfectly legitimate translation to translate it as shitty. So Joshua stood before the angels dressed in shitty clothing. All right. In other words, this clothing represents all the impurity and all the idolatry and all the paganism that comes with Babylon, having lived in Babylon. Right. And the angel spoke up and said to his attendants, "Take these filthy clothes off of him." And to Joshua he said, "See, I have taken off your iniquity, and I am giving you something new to wear." In other words, the clothing is a metaphor for the terrible effects of exile, and those are now being stripped away, and he is going to get new clothing. Then I said, "Have them put a clean turban on his head." And they gave him a clean turban and new clothing while the angel of the Eternal stood by. And then the angel of the Eternal solemnly exhorted Joshua, "Thus says the God of heaven's host, if you follow my ways and carry out the service due me, you shall govern my house and have charge of my courts. And I will allow you access among these attendants of mine." These attendants of mine mean angels. "Listen well, High Priest Joshua, you and your companions who sit before you. These men are a sign that I am bringing forward my servant, the seedling." The seedling? Zemach? Who's that? Right? Look at the stone that I have set before you, Joshua, a single stone with 7 facets, or 7 eyes, if you really want to get kind of creepy. And now I'm going to put an engraving on it, says God of the heavens hosts, and in a single day remove the iniquity of this land. All right. On that day, says the God of heaven's host, you shall all invite each other to sit under your vines and your fig trees. Oh, man. All right. So here we have a degraded, defeated people who have been allowed to return to their land, but there's a sense of inconsolable loss, of trauma, the idea that they are besmirched as a people, that they can never return to the ideal that was imagined when the Israelite society was first founded. They are all tainted with the effects of exile, with the effects of having to dwell and accommodate a pagan culture. So maybe some of them have actually engaged in Babylonian worship. Maybe that was just a natural response to feeling like they had been totally defeated. But according to Zechariah in his vision, that's not the end of the story. That unlike the elaborate process that we saw coming out of the desert, 40 years to get to the land in order to establish that, and then it took several hundred more years to establish the temple and the priesthood, God is going to make this happen in a relative instant. He's going to start with the high priest. Whatever happened before when he was living in the land of Babylon is swept away. His clothes are stripped off of him, and he is given an entirely new, beautiful outfit. He is now suitable once again to be legitimate and to serve as the high priest, whatever the past was. And that indeed, if he honors the future, if he stays faithful in the future, then he will walk among angels, and all of the leadership that has been created post-exilic, whatever their shortcomings, whatever their failings, they too will be suitable leaders for a new and holy people. And Interestingly enough, I just want to point out how uh, something like this has happened to us, or at least happened in the previous generation, which was the sudden formation of the state of Israel and the impact it had on the Jewish psyche after the Holocaust. Now, uh, history is always more messy than memory. And the fact of the matter is that the state of Israel was in the process of being created from 1917 until it appeared effectively 20 years later. Oh, no, 30 years later. But for most Jews around the world, it all seemed to happen in a flash. There was the Holocaust, and within the end, 2 years, there was a Jewish state, and it all seemed to be, uh, for some, the hand of God. And I think that's something analogous to what has happened in Zechariah. Maybe the leadership of the exiles had been working on the Babylonian administration or working with the Persians for some time to see if they could restore their territory, return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, return to their ethnic homeland, and eventually the Persians agreed. But for most people, the feeling was that this was a miraculous movement, a movement of God in history. And we can relate to that. And that's what's being described here. So sometimes history flows very slowly, and sometimes transformation happens in a moment, in a sudden pivot. And that's what this is talking about in the form of a vision. Shabbat Shalom, and I'll be talking to you next week.